My name is Tyler Jost. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Isaac Kardon, to our series on Chinese politics for this semester. Dr. Kardon is a senior fellow for China Studies in the Asia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was formerly an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College, where he was part of the China Maritime Studies Institute, where he researched China's maritime affairs and taught naval officers and national security professionals about Chinese foreign and national security policy. His scholarship has appeared in a number of different journals, including International Security and Security Studies, and later this month will be published in the form of a book entitled China's Law of the Sea, The New Rules of Maritime Order, out with Yale University Press, which will be the subject of his talk today. Isaac earned his PhD in government from Cornell University and MPhil in modern Chinese studies from Oxford, as well as a BA in history from Dartmouth University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kardon.
Thank you so much, Professor Jost. That was a really kind intro, and it's really great to be here in my adopted home state. Just came up from Newport and delighted to see a lot of old friends and colleagues in the room. So as Tyler said, I'm going to talk about this book that's coming out at the end of the month, and that is the product of many years of first dissertation field work, especially in Hainan, island in the South China Sea, working as a visiting fellow at a state think tank, an affiliation that's kind of unthinkable in the present political environment between the U.S. and China, as well as a lot of time in Taiwan as well on the same trip, another unthinkable phenomenon, and a lot of time at the Naval War College after doing my excuse me, dissertation at Cornell, working with people like Lyle Goldstein here and Peter Dutton and others who have helped me refine this into what I hope is a useful contribution to our understanding, both in the China foreign policy sphere as well as in the broader international relations and the China policy world, of whether and how China is making the rules, as we've heard, in so many different ways, shapes, and forms. And I'll get into a little bit of what I think people usually mean by that, and what I mean by it, and what I've done to try and assess whether or not China, in this particular domain of the law of the sea, has really been making or shaping the rules. And following one of my mentors at Cornell, John Kirshner, I think that the book title and even cover should tell you almost everything you need to know to write about it on an A exam, I think was his view of it, as well as the date. He was being only a little facetious, and I had to fight with the publisher a little bit to get some blue up on this title here. It was originally all red, and that's not accidental. I think I probably would have titled it with a question mark at the end of The New Rules of Maritime Order, because it is an empirical inquiry into it. But basically, it's a story about sovereignty. The Chinese flag is right at the top. That's the core concept, and that's the key principle underlying China's practice of international law generally. And I'll talk a lot about why that's important. Obviously, the ocean is there, and the fact that there's a gradient here, the fact that there's sort of this hazy area where it's neither red nor blue, is also telling the story that I'm trying to unpack in this quite long and densely footnoted book, which you'll be forgiven for not reading all the empirics, and I'll kind of fly through them, and we'll prefer to have a discussion with this group, frankly. I'll try to be brief. But in just the fact of a law of the sea alone surprised me when I first heard of it relatively late in life. It seems a little bit preposterous that you could have a body of international law which is well known for not being especially enforceable in by far the biggest thing on the planet and entirely beyond sovereign space in most of its parameters. At any rate, it is a story about China's influence on the rules governing the ocean. And ultimately, I think what I found in doing it was not exactly what I expected to discover. I kind of returned to this after, as I said, spending a bunch of time working on some other projects with the China Maritime Studies Institute. And I think the perspective that I gained on it is that, the law of the sea is only one particular domain in which China is, I guess the popular way to describe it now, in which China is competing with the United States on, but an area certainly of political contention. And I think putting it in that proper scope gave me a little bit of distance from it, and I think led to surprising results in the empirics. And I'll get into those in some detail. But basically, I think it's fair to say that China's not making new rules in the law of the sea. It's an area where they certainly have some very pointed conflicts and maritime disputes over what those rules should be. But the nature of their practice of international law, and especially the way that they conceive their sovereignty and their choices as a sovereign, makes their practice, their behavior very, very difficult to be rule forming, such that any other state would accept it or practice like it. And I'll get into what those standards should be. But yeah, I put up the table of contents here. I promised, however, I wasn't going to walk through the book chapter by chapter. Maybe I kind of will. I'll compress it a little bit, but I want to dwell on the framing. These are, of course, all American documents and leaders and their comments on it. And that is part of the framing. I'm trying to address this question that's circulating in this political environment about whether or not China is making the rules, breaking the rules, shaping the rules, all the different verbs we might imagine. And it's clearly been a major part of the US discourse on China, and one of the key ways that the top leadership has framed what's important. And I'll call attention especially to Admiral Harry Harris here, who I've had the good pleasure of meeting on a few occasions by virtue of both being in the program that Tyler and I share, the China in the World program, as well as working for the Navy. But the first time I ever saw the rules-based international order as an acronym on a PowerPoint slide was Admiral Harry Harris at Princeton University giving a talk for the China in the World program in 2017. Yeah, February 2017. And it really, particularly because I work on this subject, but I hope it kind of strikes you guys as well. That's an extraordinary thing for the operational commander of the most lethal part of the US armed forces that's most focused on China and its military challenge and the strategic problems, that he has an entirely conceptual, abstract adversary that he thinks his operational forces are aligned against. And with no disrespect to Admiral Harry Harris, he's reflecting the strategic guidance from leadership that's been passed through successive leaders in different parties, and that has really turned over the course of really the last 7, 8, 9 years. We've seen the story in the United States become much, much darker in terms of how we interpret what China's likely influence is on order, which is, of course, the kind of broader framing of this. We're talking about rules and order. And as people in this room will know, order is quite a contested concept. It's very difficult to really come to any kind of consensus definition about what we ought to think it means, and people will have reasonable disagreements. But what I tried to do is be pretty literal-minded about the rules, and specifically the rules of international law, and use them as kind of a methodological lowest common denominator. Everybody's interested in the rules for one reason or another, and they're either a lagging indicator of something, or they're a leading indicator of something, or they tell a story of something that every way of conceiving order is interested in. Even, I guess I'll move on because we're starting to shade into the theory chapter here. Even the most spare realist theories and the most spare kind of positive theories from international legal theory, which is another place that I spend a lot of time and will spare you some of the gory details. Everybody thinks of rules as being in some way quite fundamental in one version of it, or at least reflective of order. Either you have rules constituting in some way the order, and they tell you about what states can and can't do and who's powerful, or it's powerful states that impose rules on others, and it tells you something about the powerful states' priorities and the nature of their power. So either way, I just got very literal-minded, and I tried to think about, well, what are the specific rules that are being contested here in China's maritime disputes? How would we know if they were changing? And this naturally takes you into international law lands, because those are the rules that are in question. And this can go on and on and on, and I'm happy to come back to some of the international law framing. But basically, treaty and custom are the main sources of international law, and I'm sure there are lots of people who are very familiar with it, but I'll just sketch it for the sake of clarity here. And treaty laws have particular, more formal mechanisms by which they may change. Customary law, which is worth dwelling on for just a moment, is the majority of law in the international legal universe, kind of any way you slice it, and especially in the law of the sea. Customary law is basically what states do in patterned ways, in normalized ways, and from an international legal standpoint, there's an additional element of doing it thinking that they're acting in accordance with their legal obligations. You can get very close to the angels dancing on the head of the pin when you do this type of jurisprudential analysis, and the reality is in customary law, there's an active debate at the very pinnacle of the profession about what customary international law is. Even its identification has been the subject of a now decades-long study by the International Law Commission and the International Law Association, which are all kind of nested pinnacle international law legal institutions. But basically the idea is most law is a function of something that'll be familiar to us as largely political scientists here, behavior, international behavior of states. And it's repetitive pattern and sort of this subjective element of its legitimacy or its lawfulness are the real key categories. And China, as I'll get into, is particularly focused on the customary mechanisms because, of course, the unwritten law, the unwritten customs are more mutable than something that's written down in black letters, like a treaty. And so in this maybe obscure Venn diagram, what I've tried to do is just sort of show you the scope of the rules that I'm looking at and what part of order I believe they bear on. And I'm following Ian Johnston in a lot of ways in thinking about international orders. There's a great international security article from 2019 on a world of orders where he looks particularly at China's practice across a bunch of different international orders that I think kind of fit everybody's common sense definition of what ought to be an order. And so I think of them as intersecting in various ways. I think the Venn diagram helps you see that, excuse me, we can think of a maritime order, which is to say the domain of activities by states, in this case we're talking about international politics, above, on, and below maritime space. And its order and principles, the things that are important to it, have to do certainly with power in its crude forms, navies, and as well as commercial capabilities, and also the necessity for trade across the oceans, which is sort of the core driver of this. So that overlaps significantly with the international law of the sea, which I would say is a part of both a maritime order as well as an international legal order. International legal order may be a little bit easier to conceptualize because it's composed of largely treaties and customs, and there's a whole profession surrounding it. But basically the overlap is the international law of the sea. It's the main body of rules governing the maritime order. It's part of the international legal order. China's views and attitudes and approaches to both of these orders are really relevant in this discussion, and that's the way I've framed it. And then as you get kind of narrower down, the UNCLOS treaty, which I'm going to use basically, unless I say otherwise, I'm talking about the third UNCLOS treaty that was signed in 1982 and went into effect in 1994. I'm going to be focused on that as well as this kind of boxed in, and it's intentionally not a closed line box of China's maritime disputes, which touch on both the treaty, which it describes itself as codifying in some way a lot of customary international law, as well as a lot of other custom that exists alongside the law of the sea. And that's really where China has focused its attention. If you take their Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their international legal community and ultimately their formal diplomatic statements and practice seriously, there's not just as a kind of initial scoping proposition, there is not a clear effort on China's part to say, we're going to have another convention and change the rules of the treaty. Nobody's saying that. They have talked about departing the treaty. We can talk about that too. But essentially, customary international law is the mechanism. And so that kind of insight comes out of a discussion, as I showed in that prior slide of the overlapping Venn diagrams, looking at China's approach to international law and treaties and the UN generally, as well as its maritime interests. And what I want to stress here in teeing up what's to come, which is an analysis of specific rules, is that when China showed up to the UN in 1971, the People's Republic of China taking its seat for the first time as the representative of China in the United Nations, the very first major multilateral item on the agenda was what was then called the Seabed Committee, and then became the Commission, and then became a conference, and produced the biggest treaty instrument out there other than the UN Charter itself. It has the most signatories, it governs the most space, of course. Quite a substantial regime. This gentleman right here is Huang Hua. He was the first PRC ambassador to the UN. I'd like to think that he's not laughing at the treaty next to him, but in a way, he might well have been, if you can think about what the intellectual climate and political climate was surrounding China's accession to its seat in the United Nations Security Council in 1971. The entire international legal profession had been disbanded in the mid-late 1960s, and there was nobody in the delegation to the UN who would confess to being a practicing international lawyer, because that's a bourgeois profession that was beneath them as practicing, and whether they were sincere about it or not, practicing socialist Chinese who held it in contempt, including, in 1971 at least, basically the United Nations itself, which had excluded it. So it came in with a little bit of a chip on its shoulder, and the very first major instrument, as I said, that was on the table for discussion was this law of the sea. And this little bit of Chinese socialist realism about third world solidarity, it's to help the people of the world in their counter-hegemonic struggle. And China very much identified with the states that had initiated this Law of the Sea conference to begin with. It's worth noting, and one of the reasons that as a grad student I struggled with how to configure what this story was in terms of prevailing theories in international relations, is that both the US and the Soviet Union, as well as their major clients, were quite opposed to having a Law of the Sea treaty to begin with. This just on its face confuses a lot of things about why and when you ought to have a treaty that's going to bind any great power in the system. If the two great powers in the system, in a totally bipolar system, were opposed to it, how did it come to pass that you ended up with a 9-year-long negotiation and a big treaty? And it's because of what Mao called the third world, what now we would call the developing world, the global south, right? I don't know what various ways of configuring it. The Chinese tried out a lot of these, but ultimately they identified with the anti-hegemonic, anti-imperialist political outlook and ideology and goals substantively in a lot of ways of that community. And so when they showed up to this conference with this very cynical view about international law, really quite dismissive, certainly no basis for thinking that international law is going to bind the People's Republic of China in some meaningful way, they viewed this as a great way to advance their broader set of foreign policy objectives, which is to say, to undermine by the end of the conference, the socialist imperialism of the Soviet Union, as well as the imperialism of the United States. It was quite an elegant solution to a lot of their ideological issues. But the upshot of this, and I'll get into this in some detail, is that they basically ratified the treaty once it was finally ready for signatures and ratification, knowing full well that it put them at disadvantages from a standpoint of the rules. And this is noted. A lot of the research that informs this book is in official documents, whether official practice in terms of submissions to the UN, but also China's legislation, rules, and often minutes of their legislative meetings. And in this case, a vice foreign minister made a very impassioned appeal for why, even though there were severe defects and imperfections and shortcomings and a variety of different very colorful terms for why this regime that I've laid out here, and we can go back and talk about it in some detail, why it basically just puts China at a disadvantage, especially vis-a-vis the Japanese, especially vis-a-vis the Americans, the French, the British, all the ones, and the Russians, frankly, all the folks that China shouldn't want to side with. But ultimately, because maybe in some part, belief that the treaty's not all that binding. And also, I would posit due to a belief that international law is mutable and that customary law, whether they'd articulated it in this way or not at the time, that customary law is susceptible to power and to pattern practice and to change ultimately over time, that China felt it was okay to ratify first and change the treaty later in practice. And I didn't spend a ton of time with the setup there in my theory, but basically you can think of them changing interpretations within the treaty framework. The rules of the treaty are indeterminate in some ways, and so you can actually have essentially customary mechanisms for changing the way the treaty is interpreted. There are a bunch of ways to get there. Mindful of time, how much time do we have here?
We have a full hour, and
Okay.
you're only around 20 minutes in.
20 minutes in. Okay, well, why don't I try and spend 10 minutes? I'll do a very quick overview of the empirics. They are very dense in the sense of I'm looking at rule sets and individual rules within them. I've clustered them according to basically their function. So geographic rules is the first major empirical chapter. It's kind of intuitive what that's about. It's more or less the main thing that the law of the sea does from a law and economic standpoint. You'd say it's assigning jurisdiction over the space and the resources, and there are a bunch of different subcomponents of that. Entitlements is how much jurisdiction geographically you get from particular pieces of territory. Baselines, another area in which you, that's the starting point for any territorial maritime jurisdiction you'll get. And then boundaries, just to say where your jurisdiction ends and another state's begins. Unsurprisingly, and so what I've done, just the empirical strategy here, it's going to be tough to follow, but just for the gist of it, I've identified what the PRC preferred rule is on the basis of their formal statements, specifically statements into the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea UNCLOS system, as well as their formal domestic laws and rules, and assessed whether or not it meets some minimum threshold necessary conditions that could be rule forming. And again, I promise not to dwell too much on the theory, but basically I'm not trying to solve this problem the way a court or an arbitrator or any legally trained or assigned official might be. Rather, I'm approaching it as a social scientist and saying, what would it take for there even to be the possibility that China's creating new rules, that they're meaningfully introducing new rules that we're going to have to follow or someone else is going to have to follow? And this basically takes two moves. The first is China actually practicing in a way that's recognizable as a rule? Did they say, this is the rule? Do they apply the rule in a uniform way, especially over space? I think of this geographically. If this rule applies only in the north part of the South China Sea, but not the south part of the South China Sea, it's difficult to see how that's going to be a rule. And this kind of comes out of the ways courts reason about it, but it's kind of uncontroversial. It doesn't mean they've made a rule or not. It just means they would have to be virtually uniform and consistent is the language from a lot of the treaties. Then the second piece of this, which I do on each of the rules, is it takes two to tango. You can't have rules form with nobody else there. It's a fundamentally social category. Other states will need to acquiesce at a minimum to China's practice of them for there to be any basis for there being a rule forming. If they're objecting through and through, China certainly can do it. The fact of a rule doesn't mean you don't do it. It's illegal to kill people. People have done it and they will continue to do it. Don't mean to be too stark about it. But it's just not rule forming. That doesn't undermine the existence of the rule against murder that people routinely are murdered. Again, not to be too crude about it. And that's the way I think I would think about why it takes that second piece. And so what I've done is looked not in very, very deep detail as I do on the Chinese side, but just in their formal practice. Because there's a very rich record of notes verbales, they call them, but notes to the UN formal bodies about views on, in this case, China's practices and whether or not these states view them as lawful. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of practice in this regard. There's actually a lot of material, and this was a big move that I made coming out of a dissertation that was just about China to realize you really do need some necessary threshold here. At any rate, what I'll say, and I'm going to just zoom through this quickly because we can talk about any of the individual rules, is that basically You see a lot of no's in the uniformity and consistency on China's side. You're going to see a lot of objections, handful of acquiescences, all across the board when we talk about resources, when we talk about geography and boundaries. And it's not until you get to navigation where you see anything that looks like a consistent and uniform Chinese practice. I'm really zooming past it, but when you look at resources, for example, if they're not specifying what they're claiming and they're sometimes preventing states from exploiting resources in one place and then sometimes not, and there's not a trend towards more consistency, it's very difficult to see there being rule-forming behaviors. I'll talk about what I think these behaviors might do. It's not that they have no effects, but they're not forming rules until you get to this first kind of key rule in this rule set of navigation, which is innocent passage through territorial seas. And this is the first area where China's genuinely been consistent in what it's had to say about it, with some minor variations that I cite there, as well as in its application of it. It's just across the board in every territorial sea. They've been pretty clear on it. And the most important part about this one is that lots of other states in the region are also like-minded about this particular set of rules. And so it's an area where I'd say, yes, there's scope where China could be really changing this rule, even within the treaty framework in this case. Because from China's standpoint, they lodged an objection to the way that the treaty talked about innocent passage. They offered their own interpretation of it, that they view it should be the dominant one. And it just so happens that it's one that's shared by a number of states in the region and beyond, and may well have some scope for it. After that, in these high-profile EEZ navigation incidents, and these are the ones that we've heard most about, what China has had to say and do in EEZs is wildly inconsistent and non-uniform. And it's very difficult to see any other states accepting or adopting the types of practices that they have done there, as well as an important case that I spent some time with in the Taiwan Strait, which is EEZ. That's the key thing to understand about it. There's some territorial seas which are fully sovereign zones, but there's EEZ, whether it's Taiwanese or PRC EEZ, that's exclusive economic zone. That's an area where the state has exclusive economic jurisdiction, but not, from the United States perspective at least, not security jurisdiction such that it could regulate the passage of warships. So we don't see a lot of that, and we don't see this necessity, I would posit, for China to adopt a permissive set of rules about military navigation, because the nature of China's complaint, or rather its objection to US practices, is, as I mentioned earlier, it's that it violates Chinese sovereignty at the core of it. Their basic view is that because this is a zone of our jurisdiction of some kind, there's a huge, that is the thin end of the wedge for a huge amount of Chinese jurisdiction and authority and discretion about how to interpret the law of the sea. And this is where that intersection between the international legal order and the maritime order really hits home for me, which is that anything in the law of the sea can be construed to have some sovereign core. You don't get any maritime rights without sovereignty or land, territory. That's the basic mechanism of the treaty. And thus, China's been able to find its way in all of these various rule sets to more or less maximizing its sovereign discretion. And this is a rational, I suppose you could say, approach to international legal instruments in general. And it's not something that's distinctive to China either. And I'd be interested to have a discussion with folks as well about what they sometimes call exceptionalism or exemptionalism of great powers in international law. At any rate, it is not until we get to this last cluster of rules, dispute resolution rules, that you see a lot more consistency in Chinese practice. And I think that's because, in large part, this is where that international legal order view about sovereignty and its inviolability plays most strongly in China's practice, and it's a principle that leads them to actually articulate and practice a pretty clear rule. And so I look at dispute resolution within the Law of the Sea Treaty, which is the arbitration that the Philippines launched against China, specifically as the case material, as well as other cases under the Law of the Sea. China's views on what's admissible, what's appropriate for the literally legally admissible, as well as what states should do with respect to these instruments. And then I look further and further out to what are other appropriate ways to resolve disputes. Because effectively what China's saying is, no, this third-party institutional dispute resolution mechanism violates our sovereignty. We're not going to let any I've got a picture of a bunch of old white European guys in wigs in a court in The Hague. They're not going to be deciding matters that bear on Chinese sovereignty as a flat principle. And so their proposed mechanism, and students of Chinese foreign policy will be very familiar with these words, is consultation and dialogue. They translate it in various different ways, and they actually use a handful of different words. But basically, they want to do bilateral negotiations and resolve international legal disputes of all kinds, but especially maritime issues. And so the case material for this, in large part, this extra unclosed dispute resolution, is the whole process of China negotiating with all of the Southeast Asians, and the Northeast Asians. I sort of neglected to mention this, but I'm looking at all of China's law of the sea, anywhere where they're claiming jurisdiction. So this book's equally about South China Sea, East China Sea, and Yellow Sea is the main Chinese bodies of water. At any rate, on dispute resolution rules, we also see a last one that's a direct hit, which is non-recognition of rules. I'm not convinced. I'm interested in whether other folks think it might be more meaningful than I think it is. I think this is a very common practice. China denies the existence of a dispute with Vietnam in the paracels, for example. Japan denies the existence of a dispute with China in the Senkakus. This is quite normal in the region, and it's quite normal overall. And it's, again, it's kind of unremarkable. It's a little intuitive. If you don't have to recognize it, you don't have to go into an international legal process with it. It's quite normal, but I would say the upshot of all of these, and I want to just dwell on this a little bit here, is and you can see it in the book if you'd like to, and I'm happy to go back to any individual rules, but I want to close to just discuss. You can look at it from the bottom up, and you can see, as I have, that with only a few exceptions, the ways that China is practicing in the law of the sea are not forming rules such that other states could even follow them if they wanted to, frankly, except in a few narrow domains. But if we take this kind of top-down view and say, what's the overall character of the order that's created here? What's the nature of the maritime rules in East Asia? And again, this is more gesturing towards it using especially Robert Gilpin's work of thinking about kind of these macro changes over time. And what we can see, I would say, is the emergence of a much more regional maritime order and a much weaker international legal order operating there. The overall effect is not of changing rules or making new rules so much as, I would say, diluting rules in East Asia. It's a very regionalized effect, and it's fundamentally based on China's power, ultimately. It's power, but its purpose in putting it into practice to advance its particular maritime rights and interests, as they call it, in ways that I think have some, holistically, we could identify a couple effects. And here are the four that I think are pretty robust empirically, and I'd be happy to talk about, as well as the scope in which they should be affecting order, in my view. Resources is an interesting case. No state is ever going to accept China saying, we're taking your exclusive economic zone. That's basically what they're saying to all of the regional states. China has no settled maritime boundaries because of its hemmed-in geography, and it always has overlapping zones, and it's just denying, basically, it is vetoing those other states' ability to exploit those resources. In some cases, China's trying to exploit them, but by and large, no. Their fishing fleet is the most aggressive piece of this. But it's very low level, low intensity, and it's making it virtually impossible for the Vietnamese, for the Malaysians, for the Filipinos, for everybody else in the region to exploit oil and gas and fisheries. And it's a type of de facto veto jurisdiction. It undermines the law of the sea. The law of the sea is assigning these economic rights to these states, and they just don't get them. And that's pretty clear in the empirical record now. Nobody's exploiting these blocks. A case that I look into in some detail is in the very southwestern part of the South China Sea. There are Russian, Japanese, Spanish, and other international concession holders for oil blocks that Vietnam has told to pack up their kit and go home because China is making it impossible for them to hold their contracts. This is in the public record. But it's a very clear illustration of nobody would recognize China as having legitimate rights of those resources. Certainly not the Vietnamese. That's not what they intend to do. But they're recognizing, I would argue, China's perhaps legitimate in the region veto on their ability to exploit these resources. And I think that's quite problematic for order overall. Similarly, the innocent passage, as I said, I think that's genuinely on its way towards being normalized, perhaps even more globally, in the sense that the United States really is, and Lyle will, I'm sure, have some views on this as well, really the only state that exercises the rights of innocent passage as a routine global matter. There are other states that also do it in regionalized ways, to include Russia and China, as well as some of our allies. But as far as having a genuinely universal scope, and this I think is the idea I want to leave us on, is that we just don't see a lot of universal effect from China, nor a lot of universal purpose or ambition. If we're assuming, as I think the framing does from our US national leadership in this rules-based international order framing, that China intends to have its own rules-based international order, its own international order that's not based on rules or whatever it is, there's sort of a category error going on, because China's not expressed any desire for any universalization of these rules or norms in any way. I think regionalization is a better kind of framing for it, and it is what permits China to basically practice according to US sovereign preferences when they're in our exclusive economic zones, for example. This is an important empirical kind of in the weeds point, and it's maybe weird to end it on it, but I think it's worth thinking about. China goes through the EEZs and territorial seas in Alaska, increasingly, also with Russian naval forces. The United States now has made a point of saying positive things about it, because our domestic law says you may exercise innocent passage in our territorial seas. That is to say, you don't have to tell us you're coming. We don't have to give you permission. Just don't do anything that's not innocent. And there's specified rules about that. China will take advantage of that. Similarly, we don't care if they operate in our EEZ. Well, we do care, but we don't have a rule against it, and so we invite it. And I think what that tells you about China's practice overall and the way that it's likely to affect order generally is that there's not a universal scope of interest. It's much narrower, it's much more focused in East Asia and the East Asian littoral. We can talk about why that is. And I think that really, is where I want to end it. There's a lot more to say. This was a very fast, hopefully not too fast, overview of it, but I'd love to dig in on any of the subjects that you found interesting. So thank you very much, Tyler and Watson, for having me.
Great. So I'm mostly going to collect questions from the group and sort of moderate a discussion for the remainder of the hour. But I wanted to start with asking a couple of questions. I mean, this book obviously, perhaps the strongest contribution here is just a wonderfully rich set of empirics that really advance our understanding of what China's approach to this issue is. It's, to my knowledge, perhaps the first book that has really gone into detail.
I told the publishers that.
Well, yeah. And so I think the field is is in debt to the work that you've done here. I was curious about the temporal variation that you sort of allude to in the arc of the presentation, but don't necessarily, or at least perhaps you had it in there and I didn't quite understand it. But if one were to go back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, one does find, I think, a Chinese position that is different in kind from what we observe today. And it wasn't quite clear to me whether you saw that as something that is a variation that you can explain, if this is something to do with some of the content in your theory, or if it is something that is outside of it. More specifically, the discussion of the EEZ seems to be somewhat cross-sectional in the sense that you're looking at over a variety of different issues. What is the consistency and uniformity of China's position? But one does see, if one looks back to, say, the early 2000s, at least rhetorically, a quite different position being espoused. If we think about like the origins of the 83 incident in 2001, for example, does the theory help us explain some of those things?
Yeah, thank you for teaming me up to talk about stuff that I think I do actually cover in a lot of empirical depth, to include not just 50s and 60s practice, but also, to the extent it's available, back to the Qing and Republic as a just sort of a potted history of here's the kind of narrative arc of this. And there's really only one chapter that's doing this kind of chronological story, and then the empirical chapters come in and they're cross-sectionally looking at all the practice in those functional areas. And what we see is, and I think you're right in one sense that on its face, there's been a lot of change in the idea that you can discern, China's positions on the treaty or the rules or what they want. There's got to be a story there in some way. And I guess the way I would describe the story that I'm telling is that it's a cumulative interpolating of China's view on it. They had a very sparse, basically dismissive view of international law overall as late as the 19th century, literally not accepting it in any way, shape, or form, and trying to understand the development of their views on what the rules should be. And I think you see more of a convergence on what our mutual mentor Ian Johnston has called a hyper-sovereigntist attitude about international law generally. And so you actually see those principles as quite consistent early on, and that's the context Johnston is talking about it too. He's not just saying the modern contemporary PRC has that. It's sort of the post-World War II, kind of post-colonial, post-imperialist ideological orientation is quite robust in that sense. And so, EEZ practice creates a whole other type of chronological incoherence in that there was literally no such thing as an EEZ period, and in a formal positive sense until 1994 when the treaty was ratified. In a customary sense, quite a bit before the treaty negotiations even started, in the form of lots of different types of fisheries zones in particular, as well as United States practice to expand its grab a lot of jurisdiction over continental shelves, et cetera. But China's views on those rules were basically that they were indifferent ultimately to this process that it was excluded from, PRC, that we're talking about, from the 50s, 60s period that you're talking about. They view it as illegitimate, fundamentally, and I cite them to that effect. And what you see is, as soon as they're sitting in the seat, then it's worth it to play the game. And I think I dropped this point, but what I meant to say is the reason that the Soviets and the Americans could be taken downtown, as it were, and forced to be part of a treaty process they didn't want to be is that in the 70s, after the decolonization processes of the post-war era, there was finally a whopping big majority to just do stuff like this in the UN. Steve Krasner wrote about this in the 70s, and so did many others. It's like, this is the end of American hegemony, this is the rise of the illiberal West, and China was very much riding the crest of that wave then. And so what they were doing then is being a little bit indifferent to the formation of this EEZ regime in particular. My dissertation is actually just about the EEZ. This is a much broader discussion, so we could really spend a lot of time with it. But ultimately, their view of it is and has been, and this is to your point about some of the things they were saying about EEZ navigation in the 2000s, has always been that China has sovereign discretion to decide anything it wants about what goes on in an area that's under its jurisdiction, even if that jurisdiction is only economic, as the black letters of the treaty are telling us. And what they've had, one of the chronological stories you can certainly tell is, my dissertation was called Rising Power, Creeping Jurisdiction. A growing amount of capability over time, it's not that surprising a story, allows them to control more space. And again, I think it's more like interpolating around this basic principle, which is, this is our sovereign discretion to decide what the rules are in China's law of the sea, in the East Asian littoral. It's quite a big space looking at these maps. We're not talking about modest claims. This is the whole area, and the views have been evolving, and you can get into as much detail as you want, and it's the receipts are there. I'd be interested to know your take on it, but I think the story has a more of a interpolating kind of pattern to it rather than this kind of variation over time story that I think we gravitate towards.
So I want to open it up now. I think we'll take maybe 2 questions at a time for efficiency's sake. So Lyle and the gentleman to the left.
Okay, well, Isaac, thanks. Congratulations. This is really awesome. I mean, I have some idea of how much work went into this, and as Tyler said, we're all the beneficiaries. Great job. One comment, and then just a couple of questions, which I'll keep them brief. But I do think maybe for this audience in particular, important to realize that China is not the only country that has maritime disputes with the neighbors. I mean, we have disputes that go back hundreds of years with Canada and that continue to this day. And some of them are pretty sensitive, like touch serious military issues, even with Canada. And you know, you can go on YouTube and watch the French and the British fleets go at it, and that's not even to touch the issue of Iceland and that whole debacle or whatever with Britain. So I mean, I'm just saying this is not like a Chinese, a narrowly Chinese problem. People should understand that. But questions? Well, Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait in particular. I mean, we hear a lot of kind of discussion about the transit of U.S. Military units through. And I just wonder, is there a legal dispute there, or is it like information, as so many of these things? You know, I mean, take it to an extreme. Would China in the near term be wanting to control like Taiwan's EEZ and things like that? So that's one question. Another is a bit further afield. A big interest of mine, though. You mentioned Alaska. How about the Arctic? Does the book touch on China's interpretation of how the law should apply in the Arctic? Any thoughts there?
Well, thank you so much, Lyle. Lyle sat adjacent to me for much of the time I was wrestling with this. But I benefit greatly from having very, very knowledgeable and thoughtful colleagues. I'll just comment on your first point, which is you're 100% correct. There are lots of things. There's lots of bad behavior in the maritime domain, and there are lots of disputes, and most boundaries are not resolved, and most maritime boundaries are not resolved. China is quite distinctive in having no resolved maritime boundaries, except for a partial area with Vietnam. And I would argue that the intensity of their disputes and their connection to major sovereignty disputes and their geography does make them just different in kind, but I think India is usually the most instructive example here. We just had a demonstration of it because India, like China, has a very extravagant claim about ring fencing distant archipelagos with straight baselines and projecting huge zones from it. And they do it in the Southwest Indian Ocean. And the US has quietly contested those over the years, but did it loudly recently, in part to address, I think, Lyle's important critique here. But on the specific questions, there is a legal dispute in the Taiwan Strait, and in my analysis of it, it's part of the overall EEZ discussion. As I said, those are EEZs, whether they're PRC or Taiwanese. From the PRC standpoint, it's all PRC EEZ. They have land within 200 nautical miles, or 400 actually in total. It's about 100 at the narrowest point, but basically it's just overlapping zones of Chinese jurisdiction from their standpoint. And what they have done there has been remarkably inconsistent and non-uniform in enforcing it and in the ways that they talk about it. A nice illustration of this came in 2019. Lyle, you know this. Was that the 70th anniversary of the PLA Navy? Sometime in that time frame. Does that impute? At any rate, a lot of navies were invited to Qingdao for a review on this important anniversary for the PLA Navy. A French frigate and an Indian frigate, both going in the same direction, traveling up through Malacca and up through the South China Sea and through the Taiwan Strait to get to Qingdao, went through the Taiwan Strait, with an invitation to visit the PRC, but the French, who had just recently said, we're going to start sending our naval vessels to the South China Sea, to the Western Pacific. We think the Indo-Pacific is really important. We think that free and open order is really important. They were denied a call and they were sent home, and the Indian frigate, literally transiting on consecutive days, same transit from everybody's perspective, were allowed to pass. And I'll just posit to you, that's not a rule-forming behavior. Unless, I guess, the rule is there are no rules and it's up to China what you do and what you don't in this space.
You just said they were allowed to pass.
No, allowed to come call. Yeah, that's right. Everybody passes. You're right. Thank you, Lyle. They were allowed to call at Qingdao. China goes out and intercepts, sometimes with more or less aggression, usually less. And if it's aircraft, and I touch on, it's important to note, law of the sea bears very significantly on airspace. It is the way of defining the geographic parameters of it. It doesn't regulate the activities in the airspace, only defines international airspace and territorial airspace. At any rate, I'm looking at all those things and basically, no, they're not interfering with the ability to pass through, but they're claiming the right to do so and in some cases intercepting in dangerous fashion. Arctic is an area of great interest to me. It is very self-consciously scoped out of this book, even though I've spent a lot of time looking at it. And it's because this really is about China's law of the sea, China's jurisdictional waters. I believe China's views on the law of the sea and on international law matter greatly for its interest in the Arctic and its practice. And that's one of the things that one of the reasons that I want to do a book talk like this is to talk to people like you and try and understand how I'm going to extend this, because I'm trying to look at China in the global commons now. And so that is all the waters beyond its jurisdiction, which believe it or not, China recognizes that there are some waters that are beyond its jurisdiction, quite a lot of them. And that includes high seas fisheries as well as deep seabed minerals and scientific research, which I'm quite interested in, and the polar regions, which are very complex in ways that we can talk about, but ultimately kind of have their own legal regime that's adjacent to law of the sea. So I'm very interested in it. My basic sense is they have there's kind of an obvious view, which is that they're very possessive of their own rights and jurisdiction in their zones, and they don't give a damn about the rights and interests of states that actually have Arctic coastlines, to include Russia, which I think is probably the most interesting dynamic here, because China really, really wants as much Arctic access and resources for both strategic and commercial reasons as it can, and it has Russia over a barrel, and I believe that Russia will have to permit them into the Arctic, and so it's going to be a very interesting story that Lyle and I should talk about.
Sure, thanks.
Austin Yu, a material science engineer, PhD. Fantastic presentation, lots of rich and interesting ideas. I actually had two questions. The first one was on Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait, which you just touched upon. But my second one was going back all the way to the 70s. You said that China really wanted to go ahead and push ahead with ratification of the Treaty of the Sea, despite knowing that they were at a disadvantage, but that they could like potentially change the rules later. You said that they wanted to do this mainly because they knew it would undermine somehow the U.S. and Soviet Union's power. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that and why they thought so?
Sure. And delighted to have someone from outside the field come and find it interesting. That's great. Thank you for coming. So there's a lot to say about this, and I'm just sort of gesturing to this overall foreign policy orientation in the 70s. But it is also important to note that this process actually, so let's date it to China joining the UN in 71. China ratified the treaty in 1996, BRC. The treaty didn't come up for ratification, or rather, the treaty didn't come up for ratification until 1982, and then it was waiting on a sufficient number of states to ratify for it to come into effect in 1994. So you actually have this kind of staged process where China's overall foreign policy goals changed, obviously quite dramatically. And one of the great sources that I've used for this is some work that our colleagues at China Maritime Studies Institute translated originally. The memoirs of Ling Qing, who's one of the lead MFA officials, who was a delegate to the Conference on the Law of the Sea, negotiated it, was put in charge of a lot of the substantive elements, and writes quite extensively about his experience. And you can sort of interpret the changes in the political demands on him over time. And he says very explicitly on this point of disadvantage, and he's writing in the 90s, I think is when this, or maybe the 2000s. He and all the other delegates knew that the EEZ regime they were negotiating was bad for China, for reasons that you can read off the map. I didn't spend a lot of time with this map because I know how far away you are. It's in the book, and everything in it is explained carefully in the book. It's sort of a notional map of if you were to project China's claims and what they're saying, here's as good as we can say what it would look like. But basically, because of this very, very crowded geography here, it was obvious always that this was going to be a major disadvantage to China vis-a-vis other states that it viewed itself as competitive with, and just in a pure absolute and relative terms. They just weren't doing better, whereas everyone else was. I'll take that back. They made some minor absolute gains, but huge relative losses relative to the Japanese, to the Americans, et cetera, those that they view as their antagonists, the Soviets. And so that view, I think I mentioned it when I brought it up at first, starting in 1971, of course, that's when maybe the the latest possible date to which anyone would assign the full-up Sino-Soviet split. You're sitting next to a big expert, but like by then it was mostly the Soviets that was their problem. They were making peace or making friends to the extent possible with the United States, whom they still talked very, very aggressively about in the United Nations, of course, because again, they viewed the Chinese leadership, particularly under Mao, and less so under his successors, viewed themselves as leading the third world. That's Mao's concept, after all, and having solidarity with them in a struggle against imperialism, of which the maritime power, the maritime hegemony of first the Europeans and then the Americans is like the greatest illustration. So it's very resonant then. That resonance continues until today. Don't get me wrong. That's a big part of China's appeal in the global South now. It's that same fairly consistent story on it, but as a matter of practice, they're quite a bit more refined in how they approach it. They operate in lots of different domains and they have different messages for different audiences. But I would say there is a hardcore of that same view. It's still rooted in that same hardcore hyper-sovereigntist attitude, and that's a point of significant solidarity across the post-colonial world for quite obvious reasons. China now, of course, there's this interesting story where China now, and I realize I buried the lead in some ways, the United States is not in this treaty. I think this is widely known fact. But the fact that China is in it and actually champions the law of the sea in a formal sense. They said they didn't participate in the arbitration that the Philippines launched against them because it was against the law of the sea. It might be absurd, but that's where they're positioned, and they're the only ones, this is an important point, the reason that the Philippines could sue China is because they're in the law of the sea. The United States could be sued by another state if it ratified the law of the sea. It's compulsory jurisdiction. Court doesn't need to find standing or admissibility. They don't need to actually rule on it, so a frivolous claim is not going to fly. But China now is in this weird position where I think it's still basically the same purpose. This treaty causes problems for their main adversary in the system, in their view. But there's a complex relationship there, and what they want, ultimately, I think is fairly straightforward. They would prefer that the law of the sea not put them at a disadvantage, and they're working steadily towards that. And the framing of why that's important varies by audience, but I think that third world story is quite valid even today. But lots more to say there. Really interesting question.
We have time for perhaps one or maybe two very quick questions.
Yeah, Isaac, great talk. So very interesting, you mentioned that the customary laws, rules, a reflection of human behavior, right? And so really human behavior matters. But if you look, you live in China, you know, the Chinese people are generally very inward-looking, inward-thinking people. If you look at culture historically, the Ming Dynasty, 15th century, right? Chinese has the world's largest and most powerful navy force. You know the
That's
navy.
right. We know China.
Yeah, and their fleet reach as far as East Africa, right? But they never had intention to colonize those people, right? Never trade slaves. Yeah.
That's certainly part of the overall message that we hear from China about their maritime interests, which is to say, they say they're quite modest and they're quite localized or regionalized, I'd argue. But I think it's also worth noting it's actually not human being. I wouldn't make a direct link between somehow essentially or intrinsically Chinese characteristics and state practice. What I'm observing here and saying is the empirical matter is not human behavior, it's patterned state practice. And it requires actually a pretty high bar of intentionality from the state in its formal administrative capacity. And in that ways, I think China is much more similar to other states. Sovereign states are sovereign states in some important ways, not in all. I'm the last one to argue for China not being very distinctive and idiosyncratic in almost every way, but on some of these fundamental categories. And so I actually think, the story about, well, China hasn't had, I think Xi Jinping said, China doesn't have an imperialist bone in its body, or that's what it's been interpreted. That may or may not be true, but I think it's ultimately irrelevant because what we're looking at is state practice, and China's is recognizably getting much more expansive in the maritime domain to include the polar regions and the deep seabed and all of this. And so whether they intend to colonize and subjugate other nations, I think that's kind of a straw man argument. I don't believe so, but I think it's quite relevant what China wants the maritime order to be like and the rules underpinning.
No, I agree, like Wall Street.
Sir, just one more quick question. You had your hand.
Yeah, the Caribbean and the South China Sea. And a question that sort of goes in my mind, which is perhaps counterintuitive, but I'll just phrase it this way. Was Chinese leadership stupid in choosing to pour a whole lot of cement on reefs when they basically have the whole game if they follow the Caribbean model? What's the difference between them? How does it sort of fit in the model?
When you say Caribbean model, you mean the United States being the hegemon, but not having a lot of
Don't mean to be
strife with it?
controversial, but I think most people would say that the U.S. can basically control what happens in the Caribbean basin. You have a Cuban Missile Crisis, you have people thumbing their nose at you. Lots of things can happen that could be disrespectful, but if you take a broader perspective of just nothing's going to happen down there that the U.S. is really unhappy about, probably. They just make that as an assertion. Now, if you go over to the South China Sea, one could argue that with Chinese naval bases in Hainan, with all the stuff that's around there, given population, economic activity, ethnic populations in the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, everywhere.
Regionally, it's quite conducive for Chinese control.
If they want to be friendly, so to speak, in the sense of just the way the U.S. is friendly, I'm using that in quotes. You can be assertive without pouring a lot of concrete in the middle of the ocean and putting some fighter planes on it. It's just a question, what goes through my mind, just trying to put myself into the seat of Chinese leadership. If I was there and saying, look, I don't want anybody in the southeast area who I don't like. I don't want any threatening forces down there that I don't like. What's the best way to implement that policy? I was just curious whether you had any insights as to what the argument would have been. What we need to do is pour a lot of concrete and stick some fighter planes in there because that'll be the best way to get where we want to go. What was the argument behind that? That's what I'm trying to.
Sure. This is a very interesting question. I really like the Caribbean comparison, and I'll be doing some field work there if you can help. I'm being only mildly facetious, but it's interesting that I think the summary of your comment that would have gone on television would be: is there a Chinese Monroe Doctrine, right? Or why didn't the Chinese try and establish? Sure. And that's been a meme in the discussion, and I guess I think that they've done more than they needed to accomplish their strategic goals, and it's costly. I think Susan Shirk is calling it overreach, and this is maritime is usually the signal case of this. And in fact, Ian Johnston again wrote a very good piece on assertiveness, basically puncturing it in most ways except for maritime, where he said there really is a lot more assertiveness here. So they've definitely taken a policy tack since about 2006-07, based on the best research out there from our colleague Andrew Chubb, of being pretty rough on their neighbors seemingly gratuitously. And there's a lot of questions about why they have done that I think are beyond our time here, and I'd be happy to talk about it. But I think it has been counterproductive in that sense, diplomatically. But it's sort of like, 2006-07 is about the time that what everyone's calling the charm offensive just lost its charm. It was just quite offensive, and especially in the maritime space, and it's because they just started pouring a lot more resources into their capability and in their capacity. What I mean by that is like, what's the highest effect they can get, and then how long can they sustain it over how wide a period. All of those numbers are way, way up, and the pouring concrete and building bases is obviously the most concrete illustration of that. I think the reasons for doing that are basically a profound insecurity and vulnerability that they feel to the United States and its allies and partners in the region. I think that's like the fundamental strategic impetus for it. Whether or not they should have done that to respond to that fear or vulnerability, I tend to agree. They could have gone about it much better. I think they really overplayed their hand in a lot of ways. I think the Philippine arbitration is a very costly error on their part and a costly blemish on the capacity for them to actually pursue this strategy of generating customary rules, because now everyone can refer back to that. If you're going to negotiate bilaterally in consultation and dialogue with the Chinese, if you're Vietnam, if you're Philippines again, if you're anyone else, the first thing you're going to do is throw that 500-page arbitration on the table. Hopefully not in too public a way that they lose face. But that's the starting point for negotiations. So they back themselves into a much more fixed, less fluid, less a circumstance that's less susceptible to Chinese power, maritime power, than it might otherwise have been. Anyway, I think I've gone on too long.
No, that's my fault as moderator because I've gone over time. But please join me in thanking Isaac for a really